there are an awful lot of people in residential settings with dementia. 1 in 5 of us in Wales have a family member with dementia. And often this sort of increase in aggression is the main factor in deciding that residential care is required. So this is where it's kind of a deeply human issue, really, is, you know, people are being removed from their homes, from their families. And if you are going to do something as grave as that, whether that involves, you know, any sort of mental health act implementation or mental capacity act or whatever it is really, you know, that my thoughts are there's risks here of over responding to violence and aggression, which is that maybe people might be overestimating the potential impact of violence and aggression, which might then trigger perhaps inappropriate admissions or delayed discharges, versus a kind of under-responding risk as well, which is where maybe the risks might be minimized, and then obviously then sometimes you can have tragic outcomes to that. So for those of you who are on this talk, you may know of some of the methods of forensic psychology in relation to structured clinical judgment tools. Structured clinical judgment tools are basically decision support tools for clinicians, so that when they are assessing, you know, in the case of the HCR20, which is on your screen now, risk, then the structured clinical judgment approach requires a clinician to kind of go through all the key variables that are known to be associated with either dynamic or static risks of violence and aggression, and then to use that structured approach to assessment to then produce a risk formulation, which then obviously informs risk management. And the key thing, that the reason why the structured professional judgment approach was developed was because of this kind of need to always have a very clinically and legally defensible guide to action. So as a clinician, we can never just act. We always have to be able to defend clinically, legally, ethically, you know, why are we taking this approach? And when it's something as grave as potentially, you know, using the Mental Health Act, or, you know, suggesting that somebody can't live at home anymore, it seems to me that it's pretty fundamental, really. There should be some sort of structure to that decision making. So really the impetus for this was just to start doing some preliminary work to think about an evidence base around the kind of factors that might comprise such a standardized tool in future. So this review, for those who are interested, is registered on Prospero. We use the systematic review and meta-analysis protocols PRISMA. The link is on the presentation here. You should all obviously be sent that, but we will, if you get in touch with us, contact details are at the end of the presentation and we can send you that. And then for those of you who've got an interest in the technology and the technique, we can go through that in more detail. So the summary of the systematic review is, after finding that we couldn't do a formal meta-analysis quantitatively because the level of homogeneity wasn't there, we found 55 articles, or I should say Marie did, because Marie, which we included in the qualitative synthesis. So I'm going to just skim through the findings now. And so we found there were 8 overarching categories associated with aggression in people with dementia. And those are listed there. And I'll go through each of those in turn with just a summary of the findings. So when we go through these, you can see there's the factor, and then impact and no impact in the slides means the extent to which, whether or not that factor was found to be differentially associated with increased risk of violence and aggression. So where it says no impact here, so for example, taking depression, 4 studies of the total that we found showed that there was no relationship between depression and aggression, whereas 9 showed that there was. So I'll just whiz through these now, and I do apologize, in the time we've got available, it's going to have to mean that I'm going to be quite swift. But on comorbid mental health, you can see psychotic symptoms had the highest consistent finding. The antipsychotic finding in the discussion was felt to be more of an artifact of treatment rather than a cause, so that people happen to be on antipsychotics rather than them being a kind of cause of violence and aggression. Although obviously for some dementias where they are inappropriately prescribed, they can be, you know, with people with, particularly with, for example, dementia with Lewy bodies, as we know. And again, this sort of inconsistency there regarding the link with depression. On the demographic variables, key findings really was not associated more than what was. So, no association with level of education. Gender was the most studied variable. Of the studies that did find gender to be predictive, 39% found that male gender actually associated with more increased risk of aggression. Facility characteristics. So this is about, what kind of features seem to be predictive of aggression in services. Fewer papers, and this evidence base is not great. There's not a huge amount of research here. Well, we found that lack of personal space most commonly found predictor. Secure units versus residential wards, no link to aggression level, so suggesting that there was not a higher rate of aggression on people who were in secure units than were in standard residential wards. And also, interestingly, the level of recreation and the physical environment not found to be predictors, but again, very small numbers of studies here. Health issues, pain, the biggest predictor. I mean, this is one of the things that those of us who have trainees will always say, working with challenging behavior. First task, exclude pain, assess pain, and variable findings on sleep. So one study showing reduced sleep, another increased sleep associated with aggression, and a very sort of inconsistent overall association between people's overall health status, how physically unwell they were, and the level of aggression that they were showing. Interaction with caregivers, personal care, really comes out as a big predictor. That is known in the literature, I know. But also demand factors, also big predictors. And again, really the summary there, just demonstrating this need for a very high focus on the process around personal care and communication input as well in dementia services, which I almost feel a bit embarrassed saying to you guys here on this talk, because I know that you all know that and far more knowledgeable than me. On mood and personality, this came out as a theme as well, looking at people with premorbid low agreeableness on the 5-factor model of personality, which is pretty much accepted as the kind of standard model of human personality, predicted aggression. So again, interesting questions arise there around, how is that linked to aggression? It may be to do with that interaction between personality and the characteristics of caregivers and the facility that the person is in. The direct effects of dementia, this is very interesting actually. There's no relationship in the studies found between the diagnostic subsets of dementia, so that's Alzheimer's dementia, frontotemporal, vascular dementia, and dementia with Lewy bodies and aggression. Again, only 5 studies, but interesting that it didn't show that. And cognitive decline and communication were more powerful predictors, so kind of generic psychological variables rather than the specific, diagnostic variable that seemed to be more powerful predictors. Caregiver features, and again, intuitively, very, unsurprising really. So the staff who respond with more aggression, more likely to be victims of assault, low job satisfaction and perceived lack of training, very strong predictors of difficulties with violence and aggression. So in terms of the real world application of this, you may be thinking, well, why is that significant? I mean, first of all, I think it's significant because it kind of brings everything together in a proper systematic review format. But also, I think, it's really important to ensure that as people with dementia move across these multiple systems, having a process for really accurate clinical assessment and evidence-based intervention regarding violence risk is really, really important. So I don't work clinically with dementia, but our service at St. Peter's in Newport does. This is the kind of a diagram really, which one of our consultant psychologists in that service kind of uses a lot to just explain the level of complexities that often people and families have to navigate. And within that, you get this sort of violence and aggression variable as often sort of driving the movement in and out of these services. So therefore, it's accurate assessment in terms of, what's the potential impact, why is it happening, seems obviously important intuitively. Yeah, I mean, this is what I've just said, really. So, care planning, does need to account for all the clinical features that we know might predict aggression. And, violence and aggression, it causes harm and distress to everyone, including, and this is often forgotten, the person with dementia who displays that aggression, their care and their life course is often highly compromised if risk is not assessed appropriately, if it's over-assessed, this overreaction, or if there's an underreaction, obviously the consequences can be really severe. So this is just an example, really, of the kind of trajectory that somebody might have. So this is obviously not the person's real name, but a case study of somebody's life. This is somebody who demonstrates there, passed civil service exams, worked as a civil servant, national service, diagnosed with Alzheimer's at the age of 75, receiving support from secondary care due to aggressive outbursts, relationship with wife broken down, LPA was given to daughter, placed in respite care in order for family to have a break, and there assaulted somebody. So you kind of wonder what might have happened there, if we'd have perhaps known about all these factors, accounted for them, and had a standardized assessment. Again, then moved to an acute inpatient ward, while in hospital described as confused, often disoriented to time and place, often had a kind of believing that he'd returned from military service, and noted that those times of disorientation he was particularly likely to become verbally and physically aggressive, and then transferred to a higher tier service because of that aggression, and then followed a 16-week assessment pathway, which I'm going to skip over that now. People can read that later in terms of what that involved. But then there's this kind of really complex overview, and those of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with this format for person-centered formulation. And you can see here all of the features that are kind of mentioned, all sort of map on to those risk variables that we mentioned earlier. And I think, if we had a kind of separate assessment for that, I think it would be helpful in order to support person-centered formulation. So I'm going to skip over that. But the key thing with this is that, after that assessment, because of the violence and aggression, the view is that perhaps the person doesn't need to be at that level of support and security now, because the formulation has been done, the management plan has been done, but no suitable placements available close to home. So very little time to go through a kind of large and complex piece of work. I think I've got 2 minutes left now, if I'm right, Lou, is that right?
I am here, sorry. You've got 3 minutes left, so 2 minutes to my 1 minute warning.
Okay. Well, so just some proposals for further work, really, and sort of taking this forward, because we very much thought that doing this research was almost kind of like a building block, really, the first kind of the bottom layer of the pyramid of what kind of work might, be done in the future. First of all, a formal meta-analysis would be helpful around all of these studies, but we couldn't do that. Not a great quantity of studies, but the initial factor identification was helpful. And I guess my thinking is that might be used to support the development of actual clinical tools that people could use in practice to support decision-making at all stages in people's care pathway when, those concerns perhaps begin to be raised about violence and aggression in people with dementia. And I think the other thing that I would say that I think is another reason why the outcome of this study is so important is that it did find this very strong relationship between facility characteristics, staff behaviour, and violence and aggression. And I think we have to keep that in mind constantly when we're sort of overseeing and developing and delivering services. And we know, for example, that the Care Quality Commission in England has just recommended the use of the group home culture scale, which is a tool for really diving deep into staff cultures and looking at staff attitudes and beliefs about the people they look after as a way of kind of adding to the regulatory framework. And that will include does include a recommendation for use of that tool in services for people with dementia. So I think the more that we can kind of take a contextual view, really, of violence and aggression, sort of looking at those sort of fixed characteristics and also the more dynamic characteristics and bringing them together in a framework for clinicians and practitioners to use, I think that might benefit the safe management of people with dementia who struggle with violence and aggression. And yeah, I mean, that's it. Maybe that's what I've just said. I should have gone on to that slide before I just said the last bit. But just to support clinical decision making at all points in the care pathway, in the service of all of these 4 bullet points here: use of hospital and residential care, the type of service that the person needs to be in, a person-centered formulation that incorporates all of those specific factors for them that might contribute to their violence and aggression, and then person-centered care and treatment planning, which is obviously stems then from that formulation. So that is it in terms of a whistle-stop tour, really. But very grateful to have had the opportunity today. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to USW, which supported this research with Marie. And the contact details are there for us. And obviously, we're over to the questions now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Has anybody got any questions? If you want to either type them into the chat or unmute yourself and ask away. I'll just start off with.
You want me to unshare my screen now, Lou, or?
Yeah, maybe. Then we can see everyone in the room. That might be helpful. Thank you. There's a comment in the chat from Bethan, which says, usually behaviour that appears as violent or aggressive is a form of communication, usually as a result of unmet need. I don't know if there's any comments on that, but I'll let you move on to the Q&A. So has anyone got any questions? If you pop your hand up or
please, yeah, I mean, any
So Ian's got a question. Do you want to come in?
So interestingly, I noticed on the slide where you were doing the Newcastle model, that you were looking at what was the response due to? Was it down to fear? Was it down to that sort of fight, flight, or fight, flight, or the other one response? So I guess my interest is, is there literature that looks at what sort of regression are they looking at? Are they looking at a response of someone who wants to get away from something, who wants to sort of fight their way out of it? That's kind of my question.
Okay, so thank you for that. I know that Marie, one of the issues with doing the research, I mean, your question is a very good one. And one of the problems is the definition of aggression and violence, and obviously you can't separate that from the function of violence and aggression. Marie, I don't know whether you, as in why it's happening, which is obviously the most important question. Marie, did you want to answer Ian's question there at all about the issue with definitions and that we had?
Yeah, it was a bit daunting in terms of how do you define aggression, how do you define violence, and there were wide disparities in how they were defined across the various studies. And through doing the systematic review, in hindsight, I might have used a different definition and different search functions to actually look for what is meant by aggression, because often agitation was included in that definition. And again, separating out the cause and the reason for the aggression wasn't clear from the initial search. So that could be something that could be explored further, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of, if they're not looking into the cause, but more about the aggression and what sort of precursors are, then it kind of doesn't give you the full picture of why are we investigating it in the first instance.
So, yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that. I mean, obviously, the function of aggression, you haven't done an assessment unless you've looked at the function of aggression, and structured professional judgment tools, that is their output. The output of doing one of those assessments is to get a really good overview and formulation of the contextual and clinical function of violence and aggression. So in order to do that, you need to be, the idea is that you're kind of directed on a path. So you include all the relevant variables that you need to kind of include in order to come to that formulation of why the violence and aggression is happening, and also then a judgment about the degree to which that, the potential impact of that violence and aggression, and obviously then the plans on how that's best sort of prevented and managed. So yeah, I completely agree with what you're saying.
Thank you.
Thank you. We've got just under 3 minutes left of the Q&A. It's flown by. So I'm going to go to Karen, who also has a hand up, please.
Oh, hi there. Thank you for such a lovely presentation. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you.
Yes.
Hi. I really, it's a kind of, I don't know, it's such a wide question I've got, but I work in a care home, and thinking, reflecting on what you said about the pain aspect, we're always, I'm going to choose my words carefully here, but the care staff often subjectively say the person isn't experiencing any pain when the resident we've gone to see clearly is. So really, there's that kind of obfuscation of what the carers are feeding back to us. Obviously, with COVID, we can't go in and observe our lovely residents to the level we'd like. And I was just wondering, has that ever come up for anybody on the panel today or in any questions before? Thank you very much.
So, Karen, just so I can clarify the question, so it was around the extent to which unobserved variables make it difficult to do the assessment. Is that what you're saying? So you're not always there, so you can't rely on people's report?
We can't, we're going in intermittently and we can't always get a fuller picture. It's a bit like Nick Andrews with the elephant analogy.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
somebody just said about the pain ad. I've just started to try and cascade that out. But I often think I don't want to be didactic to the care staff as well, where I'm like, by the time I finish speaking to you, you will know this. We kind of work, we want to work cooperatively, but we're just seeing a culture then of, you know, of that person, or they're not in any pain, but without any thought or curiosity behind it. It's like, sometimes I want to give the care staff permission or confidence to be curious.
Yeah, I think, Karen, I mean, great to have a longer conversation about this, because I think there's a whole range
it's such a big question
that you raised that actually come up with me in my clinical work, because I work with people in the community social care with forensic mental health needs clinically, and it's something that it's a challenge, isn't it? Yeah.
But thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm going to come in because it's time now to hand over to the next presenter. So Ben, I can see that you've got your hand up. Are you happy to write your question in the chat? And I don't know if Andrew and Marie can respond in there for you.
Yeah.
That would be great. Thank you very much. So thanks very much for both of you.
Thank you, Lou. Appreciate